So I'm going to do something a little different with the first of these Haftarah coffee break videos. If you're wondering why I'm calling it that, link down below to the intro video to the series. The traditional Ashkenazi reading this year is actually the special reading for Shabbat Machar Chodesh, or the Shabbat when the new moon falls on the next day. I have a drasha for that, but it did not feel appropriate for this week. That will reappear at some time in the future. The Sephardim, however, do not use a special Haftarah, and so the traditional text from Isaiah that begins with, "Thus says the eternal God, who created the heavens and stretched them out," clearly ties into Shabbat bereishit and the creation story of chapter 1 of Genesis. What's interesting, however, is what comes next. Let's call it the implications of creation. How do we go from who spread out the earth and what it brings forth, and who gave breath to the people upon it and life to those who walk thereon, to a few verses later in the Haftarah, God goes forth like a warrior, whipping up rage like a fighter, yelling, roaring aloud, and then charging upon the enemy. How can the two possibly be related, and why would I want to bring that up this week? What it comes down to is creation is one of those words that we use because it seems so obvious, but yet we don't really contemplate the implications and what part we play. So, because I do not have the heart this week to tackle the concept of a God who whips up rage like a fighter, I have one of the most important chapters from my book that explores this concept in an important way. Appropriately enough, I guess, the chapter is called In the Beginning, and links below for how you can get a hold of this book if you have any interest. If we're lucky, maybe this even backs us into understanding how creation and battle could possibly be connected. To put it differently, this chapter has nothing on the surface to do with our Haftarah or what is happening in Israel, and yet is at its core exactly about both, in the most meaningful way I can possibly express. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Imagine that you are preparing to write a symphony, or an opera, or a musical, or the greatest rock or pop song ever. Whichever of these resonates with you, choose that one and work with me. The task in front of you is both personal and communal, creative and absurd. As long as you are not actively and consciously engaged in the act of plagiarism, you are going to be immersed in the unique and individual act of creation. Ask 100 composers or writers how they get their inspiration and watch them stumble over translating the wordless into an unsatisfying analogy, or watch the more practiced interviewee use a rote response that they will, after a scotch or two, admit captures nothing of the actual creative impulse. In the beginning, there's a need or a requirement, whether conscious, such as a book contract, a commission, an upcoming album, an upcoming YouTube video, or unconscious, like what was in Coleridge's synapses when he lay himself down and dreamed the opening verses of Xanadu. And then comes something. That something is ineffable. We cannot do any better than approximate that something that occurs between the need and the execution of that need. We use words like inspiration and revelation, but in moments of honesty and clarity admit that they are pale words to set against the actual experience of inspiration and revelation. Not because they're too small, but because inspiration is often so simple as to be mundane or unnoticeable. It comes mostly without fanfare, allowing the work to begin. But this is visually ineffective in a movie, and so we tend to be taught that the trumpets from heaven are a requirement for the big moments of inspiration or revelation. And then, after that non-trumpet indescribable spark arrives, after more work than the marketers of creativity workshops will ever put in their pamphlets, the end product, the opera, the musical, the greatest guitar riff ever, crowd cheers, standing ovation, immortality. Or this is pure silliness, and the writing or composing is just combination and repetition of what already exists. There is nothing new under the sun. Why pen the newest love ballad when the Times reviewer will rightfully remind the reader that it sounds quite a bit like that other one from the 80s, just with less synth? Mozart didn't invent the symphony, he just did pretty cool things with it, and Wagner could only push functional 18th century European tonality, yes, Rabbi talking about Wagner, I know, sorry, to the breaking point by there first being something to break. And even if my symphony sounds nothing like Beethoven, I'm stuck with either mimicking the form that was already generations old to him, or deliberately breaking the form because I can, because I'm aware it's there, which still shows I'm in dialogue with the form of the symphony. Put differently, maybe Lady Gaga wasn't copying Madonna with Born This Way. But, to be fair, there are only so many ways that we can stick the same 3 chords together over and over without getting some overlap, and Madonna did not begin her extended version with,
"This is the manifesto of Mother Monster."
well, that's different than Madonna, isn't it? It's actually not quite as terrifying as it sounds to loop symphonies, operas, musicals, and pop songs into the same discussion, as although Beethoven might make a more interesting theme and variations of the 3 chords and basic melody of Respect Yourself, including at least 1 excursion into minor and 1 shock of a French augmented sixth. Sorry, music nerdiness there. They are all relying on basic building blocks that move toward a vanishing point somewhere in the distant past. Wagner relies on Beethoven, who relied on Mozart, and Haydn, who both relied on Bach, the pinnacle of the Baroque cloud of creativity built on Vivaldi and Telemann and Buxtehude. They all evolved out of the modal music of the sacred and profane, the Palestrinas and the Morley, Wilkes, and Wilbys, who wrote their music on the backs of ecclesiastical music that evolved from the plain chant to organum to polyphony, or the secular traditions of the troubadours. Those modes coming out of the early church most likely combined elements of Greek modes and the temple modes from the highly complex musical traditions in Jerusalem that stretch back into a foggy earlier time. The Jerusalem temple modes, remember, they had full choirs and orchestras there of Levites, were probably derivative of Persian ones, but did the Persians perhaps get theirs from the Jews that were in diaspora from the Babylonians when Persia became dominant and subsumed the surviving Israelites? We're now back 2,600 years. What did the music sound like that David danced to as he entered Jerusalem? Did he learn that from his older siblings singing around the campfire? What was sung around the campfire? And did it sound closer to the recitation of an Icelandic epic, Homer in the original Greek, or the Beatles after some psychotropic help? What did the earliest version of the Song of the Sea or the Song of Devorah sound like? Now we're back over 3,000 years. And when you hear the sounds of the reconstruction of the Neanderthal flute made from a bone of a cave bear 40,000 years ago, I dare you to claim it has no connection to what is recognizably human today. When I create something, when did the act of creativity begin? And how much of it can I claim to be mine? How much and what kind of responsibilities do I have as a creative agent from within such an overwhelming continuum? Anyone who has ever written a song only to have a hipster roll their eyes, cluck their tongue, and utter the phrase, "That's so derivative," has to deal with the truth of the mockery. At the same time, our hypothetical hipster might also want to try to write a song on their own, to get a sense of balance and to learn to speak to others through the compassion that can only come from personal effort and the risk of failure or mockery. 2 moments of learning are present here: the knowledge that we cannot exist without what came before, and the act and effort of trying to create despite that knowledge. Luckily enough for us, Judaism has the perfect phrase to help us become slightly more complex than those yelling at each other across social media platforms that I'm right, you're wrong, and there's no place for nuance. The most famous arguing schools in the evolution of Jewish law were that of Hillel and Shammai. Even after their founders had passed, their academies continued their disputes, and in one of the most famous stories of these debates, a point of halakha, or Jewish law, had been argued for 3 years, putting aside for now the fact that 2 groups could continue speaking with each other after disagreeing for 3 years. The story from the Talmud eventually leads to a voice from heaven crying out, "Elu ve'elu devarim elihim chayim." Both of these differing opinions are equally the words of the living God. Less important for the specific narrative and more important for this moment in the world as it is, and the question of how we can step back from the brink of tearing each other apart, the text continues by asking, since the heavenly voice declared both of these are the words of the living God, why was the halakha established to follow the opinion of Hillel? Answer: it's because the students of Hillel were kind and gracious, and they taught their own ideas as well as the ideas from students of Shammai. Not only for this reason, but they went so far as to teach Shammai's opinion first. Yeah, we have nothing to learn whatsoever from our traditions. Returning to our acts of creativity, Judaism also helps us out with the subtlety of negotiating how we understand our personal acts of creation from within a universe where the raw materials for that creation, such as those 3 chords, have predated our efforts to make those 3 chords meaningful. Every morning, regardless of the stream of Judaism or geographic origin, the Siddur, or Jewish prayer book, asks us to meditate on creation itself. Blessed are you, Eternal One, our God, sovereign of all time and space, who forms light and yet creates darkness, who makes peace and creates all things. In goodness you renew continuously and every day the works of creation. How numerous are your works eternal, all made with wisdom, filling the entire earth with your creation. And there's enough here for an entire book. But for our purposes, this tiny snippet of a much larger blessing contains within it all 4 separate words in biblical Hebrew for to create. Bara, yatsar, asa, and kana. Don't tune this out. This is critical, and this leads us to something pretty important. It's going to be a journey, though. Bear with me. As usual, the translation into English hides the subtlety of Hebrew. The prayer, even in translation, is beautiful, but these 4 words make it much easier to understand the place of our moments of creativity from within the infinite nature of all that exists and has come before. Contained within these words is the guide to help us differentiate what we can take credit for from that which forces us to bow in humility as we become more aware of the shoulders upon which we stand. The first of these words, bara, means creation ex nihilo, something from nothing, yesh mi ayin. This one we don't get to claim as it represents the unknowable beginning of creation. The same Hebrew word is used in the very second word of the Torah. What did the Eternal do at the time of the beginning? The Eternal barad. Don't try to translate that because you will get lost in the English. I create, you create, God creates. The perfectly appropriate usage of the same word in the 3 phrases creates the unconscious illusion that all creation is created equal. That my finite understanding of a word can, when I use the same word, be used to understand something not finite. The words in translation are the same, but are pointing to completely different concepts. The first appearance of God on the scene in the biblical narrative is this verb, bara. God's first manifestation in our narrative is that of action, and that action is the representation of the movement from what could not be known to what is known. Commentators and mystics have long noted that the first letter of Torah is not the first letter of the Aleph Bet, but rather the second. Why? Because the Aleph by itself has no sound or meaning until paired with something else. Until it has been paired, we don't know that the Aleph is there if it's unseen. We can't say anything about it. The Aleph existed before all, but could not be manifest until the unknowable became manifest in the act that began creation. As Hebrew is read from right to left, the actual first letter in the Torah, Bet, visually captures this mystical truth. To the right of the letter, before creation, the letter's closed, unknown. But to the left, the letter opens up as Torah opens. We don't know if this is the beginning, as is suggested by many translations, just that it is the first act of creation that we can comprehend. Not the beginning, but a beginning. Bara, then, is that which opens up the unknown to becoming knowable. In the case of our perception, this is the potential for something tangible, all of which is symbolized over the later verses in Genesis chapter 1. The second verb, yatsar, as well means to create, but in the specific sense of forming something out of something pre-existing. In our world of tangible knowledge, this might be likened to the neutrinos, quarks, and electrons that formed in the first 1/1,000,000th of a second after the Big Bang. The bara of the universe is the template for all potential. Yatsar is the act of forming something tangible from that potential, or perhaps Yatsar is the measurable evidence of the mystical template. For you philosophy folks out there, look at how similar this is to Platonic thought. The third verb, asa, as well means to create, but this time in the sense of making or doing. Jumping way ahead in the class, theologically this is the design element that can be typified by any biological need. The beehive or spiderweb are acts of asa creation for the purpose of those creatures' various survival needs, just as video games, Lululemon, and Twinkies are for ours. We don't get to asa an apple, as that's already been yatsard for us, but we can claim asa for our orchards. But the orchard also crosses into the final act of creation, kana. This one to the English-speaking mind seems less like creation until we use an analogy like the orchard. Kana literally means to possess, and in modern Hebrew is most often used as to purchase. It's easy to get trapped at this point into mumbling something about consumerism, but that's not what kana, creation, is trying to highlight. Rather, the sense of creation in this word is perhaps the most important for understanding our place in creation, and the ultimate patterns of unifying the brokenness of the universe. And this is also how we can understand these two disparate parts of our Haftarah this week. Kana means we need to own what we create. Not in the sense of buying or owning Shabbos candles. Rather, we need to own the Shabbos candles in the same sense of needing to own up to our failures and our responsibilities. We need to own our own lives. The beginning of kana in our anthropology is when a being capable of learning and passing on that knowledge, two parts of it, takes notice of something that has been yatzard. Let's assume that a prehistorical version of us, for instance, is the first in our tribe to see an apple tree in some distant field. So we utilize a process that's already been asad for us by a person who owned their place in the world and took responsibility for pointing us to the same path, the process by which we take the smallest bit of the fruit into our mouth to see if it's bitter or burns with the telltale signs of something poisonous. If it burns, we spit it out and own, kana, the responsibility of communicating this knowledge. If it doesn't burn, the process moves through the phases of testing more and ingesting more over time until it's determined to be safe, then communicating this to the tribe. If the fruit becomes important enough to our tribe over time, especially if it becomes central in some way to our survival, the original act of a practically trained tribal member testing and probing will be retold so that the process of testing can be passed on via story or song, along with the importance of the fruit of that kind of tree. And for you literalists out there, the story as it is told after generations will bear little, if any, resemblance to our experience when we first put the tiniest bit of apple in our mouth. But objective historical accuracy is in this case not in any way useful to the needs of the tribe. The tribe needs to own the apple. Its place in lore and practicality needs to be communicated and learned, so the story must be told in the way most effectively rendering it compelling enough to be remembered and repeated. As the tribe matures in its understanding of the apple, it may honor it with ritual, a holiday when the blossoms appear, or after the mysteries of cultivation become manifest, a celebration or a blessing upon the planting of a new tree. As the tribe becomes more sophisticated regarding passing on its knowledge, perhaps the stories fade as mythology is replaced by a semester at university. But by now, kana also includes how to plan the ideal orchard, how to divert water, and how to fertilize. Eventually, our owning the apple tree includes owning the changes we might have once unknowably made to an ecosystem, to the ability for soil to sustain our apple needs to further generations, and to the implications of shipping the apples worldwide. The act of creation implicit in kana is nothing less than the responsibility of consciousness. It's always pointing us further. And as consciousness is something that borders on the indescribable, the ineffable, itself begins stepping back into a fog of the intangible. This once most hard to understand, consumerist-seeming aspect of creation is the one that when most elevated, that we take responsibility, leads us back most closely to the mysteries of that original, unknowable bara. Possession in kana is not the one with the most toys wins. Kana is the act of creation associated with recognizing that all we touch has the potential to lift up or to tear down. Kana is the placing of responsibility over entitlement. Kana is not merely the writing of a symphony. It's the intentionality behind the composition, followed by the intentionality of the publishers, producers, directors, musicians, building staff, ushers. Bringing this to another full circle, my act of creation, even if it is another variation of the three chords, clearly rests on foundations that go back to the potentiality of the moment of creation. This is daunting. This is also the entire point of kana. Rather than hiding my head from the hypothetical sneering hipster and believing that the act of creation is preordained to fail for lack of true originality, our job is to partner with the eternal in that daily renewal of creation, as is suggested by the yotzer or blessing. We do this by consciously stepping into the daily and continuous act of creation, specifically the parts that we can touch. In our case, that means making and doing with our hands and minds to create our human analogs of the beehive and the spiderweb, building the tools and structures needed for individual and tribal survival. Then, we are constantly to strive to make our relationship to the act of making and doing as broad and deep as possible until that final product can be elevated, can be enabled to become the best, most useful, most healing, most unifying version of that spark of potential that we with our tools and limitations could achieve. And then we pass that on and let the next generation elevate that even further. And perhaps at this moment we should add that the word for this type of elevation in biblical Hebrew translates into the English word holy. Being in dialogue with the eternal, that which is greater than us or that which unifies us, for how we make, do, and own, is an essence of participation in holiness. Judaism itself and its evolution can be seen through the lenses of each of these four verbs. There is the unknowable, the parts of our origins that are lost in the past, or more mystically, the parts that reflect some platonic, unknowable perfection in a light that will blind us if we are somehow able to gaze into it. Then there is the raw material from which all traditions draw, the evolutionary need of humans to band together into tribes of mutual meaning, practicing elevating rituals and developing effective tools and morals in order to survive the unforgiving out there, or overcome the threat of the approaching other. We began to call it Judaism at the third level, where our specifics differentiate into something unique that has proven itself as a pattern of thought and behavior that carries our specific tribe into the future. It has allowed us to survive. And then finally we have this moment in time and the dialectic of individual and communal responsibility to make those tools, texts, and rituals and own them. Then through owning them, elevate ourselves and others. Part of the kana of Judaism has been the fascinating chain of custody of the various Jewish narratives over time to give us a functional master narrative. What I mean by functional is that it worked above and beyond. If the purpose of any systematized mythology is to give the people that hold the mythology the tools to survive, then the Jewish version should astonish. One of my greatest joys as a rabbi has been to visit schools and talk about Judaism. Usually, in this day and age, when such words are uttered by a religious leader, the listener reacts with some trepidation. Especially in the United States, there is an ideal of church-state separation, and what place does any religion have of sending a clergy member into the schools? Well, apart from the fact that proselytizing is not a part of Judaism and has not been a part of it for millennia, learning about Judaism and the Jewish people crosses over into history and social studies classes, in addition to comparative religion if a school system is fortunate enough to have such a class taught well. The unconscious hubris of a Christian-dominated society is that since Jews and Christians ostensibly share a holy text, those non-Jews that grew up in the Christian-dominant society will know roughly as much about Judaism as they do about Christianity. When you get people to probe into their unconscious assumptions, what you will tend to find is, especially in the States, much less so in Europe, that most people assume that Judaism is pretty much just like Christianity, just without really understanding Jesus in the same way. If that unconscious assumption remains there, there can be no learning. Learning is not possible when one already knows something. And if that knowing contains, false knowledge, well, it doesn't matter. I already know about that. So in order to teach about Judaism, you first have to get a question mark to appear next to what someone knows. That's in quotes, scare quotes. One of the ways that I've begun to tease this out with youth relates to the remarkable survivability of the Jewish narrative. It goes something like this in my first few minutes of being in a class. How many Jews are there in the world? Sometimes after the initial looks of confusion and passive calculation, I then rephrase it into something easier to guess. Out of all the people in the world, what percentage of them are Jewish? This exercise is illuminating. Try it yourself, especially if you are not Jewish. Right now, what would your guess be? Instinctively, the first thought that pops into your mind. I'll give you a second. For youth between 12 and 18 in Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States, where I've done this exercise, the lowest answer I've received is 1%. And before you get excited, that was one person at one time out of literally hundreds. The highest was 85%. 85% of the world population is Jewish, from a 16-year-old at an elite private sectarian school in the UK. The usual answers range from 10 to 25%, and I just did this exercise again a few months ago. The lowest was 7%, the highest was 40%. 17-year-old students in Germany. The actual answer is around 0.2%. Why the discrepancy? Better asked, why the wildly and insanely inaccurate perception of Judaism? And may I also add, everything associated with it. The answers are many, and mostly out of the purview of this video. Disproportionate coverage of Israel in the news, or quite frankly, inaccurate or anti-Israel bias in the coverage of Israel in the news. Perceived disproportionate presence of Jews in such varied milieus as Nobel laureates in entertainment, the Jew as the shadowy nightmare figure cited in just about every conspiracy theory, and so on. But the numbers are so out of line with reality, and the answers are so consistent, that there's something there. Back to our narrative. What's critical here is that Jews and Judaism shouldn't exist. And yet the passive, unexamined thoughts in those going through Western educational systems is that there are perhaps billions of us. How in the world did that happen? Religions go through a sort of great filter as they run their course. As we exist in a global reality, it's hard to remember how new that global reality is, and to understand that throughout all of human history, the vast majority of religious systems have been local and have passed away, syncretized with another system, or have been subsumed by a more dominant religion. Pay attention. This is important. Roughly 85% of the world population claims membership in a religious group, and out of them, 3 world religions, Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism, account for roughly 85% of these adherents. To get to that point, each of these religions had to have a perfect storm of factors, including the strength of the narrative, cultural utility, population pull, and effective transmissibility. As a backwater people in a tiny and sparsely populated geographic religion with no central tenet to convert one's neighbors, Judaism does not fit this pattern at all. Most religions lacking all of these factors will not make it out of the tribal phase. Empires come and go, but eventually one is going to come along and wipe you out or bring you into the fold. Jews evolved in the crossroads and battlegrounds between whichever empire held sway over the Nile River and which held sway over the fertile basin of the Tigris and Euphrates. Judaism should not have made it out of its tribal phase, being surrounded by such greater empires, but it did. Then, Judaism should never have survived the Babylonian exile after the destruction of the First Temple, but it did. And Judaism absolutely should have not survived the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, but it did. By the time the Romans came along, Judaism was thoroughly and completely a Near East temple state whose religion was based around a sacrificial cult. By the time of the Romans, the ritual sacrifice required by the cult could only be practiced in a single location, explicitly Jerusalem, due to internal rules and regulations. Worse, the Roman Jewish wars killed nearly half of every Jew that existed on the face of the planet at that time. And if that wasn't enough, we seemed to have made our survival yet more improbable through our own words. The texts of Judaism that we know as the Tanakh had mostly been firmly established by the time of the Roman occupation of Judea. These texts acted as a sort of religious and legal constitution for a kingship, a priesthood, and sacrificial cult. After the year 135 of the Common Era, dates, that kingship had not existed for over 700 years. The temple was again destroyed and could no longer be rebuilt, and the city that needed to house the temple, Jerusalem, could no longer even be visited by Jews. And yet, somehow, over the next centuries, a group of thinkers and leaders whose interpretations of Judaism mostly dated back to the Babylonian exile were able to make the case not only that the lineage dated back to the same revelation that gave birth to the temple sacrificial cult, but that the system of dialogic discourse and personal and communal prayer was a proper replacement for temple ritual. More incredibly, they argued that their version of prayer was established in Torah, that it was the correct understanding of Torah, and that it also was superior to temple sacrifice. Not only is this a breathtaking, stunning type of chutzpah, it demands that we ask the questions as to the nature of the Jewish narrative. What was it about Judaism that could allow for religious evolution, and even the thriving of a religion that should have, on multiple occasions, disappeared into the same historical footnote that included the worship of Tiamat, Amun-Ra, and Shemesh? It would be nice and neat if we could point to a single point, a literal Sinai, where some prophet placed a stylus on papyrus, wrote "in the beginning," and continued with a perfect spinning forth of an inspired narrative. It would be nice and neat if we could easily study a moment in time that would contain all the tools and gravitas needed to ensure the survival of a people and religion. It would be nice and neat to have a single, clear answer to understand what enabled the continuation of those that, by all probability, should not have survived as a unique people and religion. But remember, that type of one prophet, one stylus, one papyrus, one literal moment in time is bara. It's creation from nothing, creation ex nihilo. Even if a single prophet did, in a single moment, write "our in the beginning," they still would have been doing so on the top of the bara, creation from nothing, Yetzar, formation from the pre-existing, and even the Asa, doing and making from necessity, that brought them to that moment of inspiration. What more likely has happened is that the very first composition of In the Beginning in the lineage of Judaism occurred in the mists of time around a campfire with people that would have nothing that would make them recognizably Jewish to a Jew today. What more likely happened is that countless other versions of In the Beginning would emerge as the world changed around this evolving tribe and new elements joined the tribe and expanded its understanding of itself and the world. Every one of these individuals or groups that took the three chords in their hands did so through their own asa and kana, an amazing moment of creativity that started and ended with taking ownership of all that had been passed on to them, with the necessity of empowering the tribe at that moment to survive until the next person or group could take on composing their version of In the Beginning with their variation of the same three chords. At some point, one of those In the Beginning compositions, along with all that spun out with it, resonated and was adopted by a larger group. This version, perhaps with a catchier tune or a wittier internal logic, became the de facto telling of that story. At some point, it got written down on a piece of parchment that ensured the story would not need to rely solely on the storytellers, at the same time limiting the ability for that In the Beginning to be significantly changed. The question is, at what point was the In the Beginning written that became our In the Beginning? And then perhaps the more important question that follows is, what was it about that In the Beginning that allowed it the elasticity to survive burnt temples, Roman emperors, global dispersion, pogroms, and Hitler? And what with all my heart, I hope, will allow it to survive this present moment in time. Part of owning our part in a religious tradition is taking upon ourselves the responsibility of looking unflinchingly at how we came to be where we are, what the implications are for us today, and how we pass this on to the next generation so that they can elevate it even further. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Take care. We'll see you next time.
tevel, tevel, b'tzedek.